I hope that you will join me in our upcoming Radical Theology Seminar, where we're going to talk about Mary Daly, and you're going to hear a straight white guy talk about a lesbian feminist who was not interested at all in men. And I hope that the participants can really challenge me on my own views too. Right. My name is Chris Rodkey, and I am the pastor of St. Paul's United Church of Christ in Dallastown, Pennsylvania, which is directly between Harrisburg and Baltimore, and in South Central Pennsylvania. I'm also a regular adjunct at Penn State York campus, and I do some publishing work. And currently, I am an announced candidate for the State Assembly of Pennsylvania in the 93rd District, which is a campaign that is going on as we speak right now. My first encounter with Mary Daly was probably like a lot of people's first encounter with Mary Daly, for those that have encountered Mary Daly, was through Audre Lorde's open letter that was written, and it's found in a lot of women's studies readers, introduction to women's studies courses. It's sort of an example of transition from second and third to third wave feminism. And what I knew about Mary Daly was what I was told by Audre Lorde, and I sort of accepted that at face value. What I found later, and I did not return to Mary Daly for a long time until I was in a doctoral program at Drew, and one of the things we were going to read was Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father for a class, and I read it and I was just blown away by how much this appears to have been influenced by Altizer and Hamilton, the Death of God theologians, and also just how steeped it is in Paul Tillich. And that was my academic interest in going to graduate school, was Altizer and Tillich, and how Tillich influenced different facets of theology after his death. Well, I came to realize that Tillich had an enormous impact on Mary Daly, and she did not hide it at all. She wrote about it, and she called him the patriarch with good ideas, but really borrowed from him significantly. I also liked what I saw because as a moral system, she proposes something that is akin to like a Thomistic Catholic worldview, although it replaces Catholicism with a feminist ecological view that she invents. But it has the same sort of moral structures to it as a theory. And I found it very interesting how she, as a Catholic post-Christian thinker, the further away she got from anything recognizably Christian, the more Thomistic and Tillichian she really became. And the Beyond God the Father, the first part of it, which was one of the readings for this group, I think is pretty obvious to see where this came from in terms of the death of God controversy. When I wrote my dissertation, I was convinced that I would find something that Mary Daly had written that wasn't discussed by secondary literature later, that connected her more closely to the Death of God movement, and I in fact found it. And looking at microfilm, microfiche in the library stacks, and found an article, I believe in Commonweal, that she wrote in occasionally, but there was one article that I hadn't seen in a bibliography before that made that connection and actually mentioned she was writing a book on the Death of God theology. Later, I found some evidence where she said that the first part of Beyond God the Father was the condensed version of what she was planning on doing in this aborted book project. So I included her in my dissertation, and she came and spoke at Drew for the Nell Morton lecture, the annual Nell Morton lecture. And I think somebody heard that I was writing on her, so they asked me if I wanted to pick her up at the airport. And that was a bizarre experience. So anyone that knows anything about Mary Daly, I usually will sort of name drop that I had Mary Daly in my car once, and and she speaks like she writes, and in sort of circular fashion. I would ask about Boston College where she taught, and she'd say, well, the Jesuits, they're Jesuitical, aren't they? That sort of thing. She was apparently had Alzheimer's at that point, or dementia, or one of those things. I'm not quite sure what it is she had, but she was not at the top of her game then, and she got confused on the airport, and so I think what I saw her might have been one of her last public appearances. But that was right around the time her last book, called Amazon Grace, came out. So and we'll come back to the Audre Lorde question, but I think an important lesson to take away from Mary Daly is that the Audre Lorde critique that everyone knows about, I think, is a legitimate critique. But I think it's a little unfair to Mary Daly. But there's lots of other problems with Mary Daly's writings too. But I think there's a lot of good to take away, and helpful things to take away. For those who know Daly, I think from the outside, she became a symbol of a hater of men. And some of the things she's written did not help her in a defense of that. But I've come to accept that her writing was just not interested in the ontology of the male. That all of philosophy throughout the centuries had dealt with that. So it's now to go in a new direction and think differently. For those that know her earlier work, her middle and later work, I think, is really fantastic, and develops these ideas. Her book Gynecology is the center of the Audre Lorde debate, and I often use that text in my philosophy classes for college students, and as a way of bringing up the conversations about race and class and colonialism that Audre Lorde raises. But her book Pure Lust, I think, is really brilliant. I think it's an important book that is often overlooked. And her later work is sort of bizarre, but it brings in elements of feminist history that I wasn't aware of. Some of them I think were relatively obscure, but it was helpful to read, and also the more Talikian it became, the more sort of out there it became. And in her last book, she did talk about the Audre Lorde situation, which was not revealed until that book was published, that Audre Lorde's biographer had in fact found Mary Daly's letter that she did return, right? The whole point was Mary Daly didn't write back to her because there was no response. Well, as it happens, Audre Lorde had the letter and kept it. And I think that's, and Mary Daly just said something like, well, I didn't respond because I thought her questions were important. I thought the things she was raising were important. And that's a valuable voice that I didn't need to step in the way of. And I thought that was pretty gracious, considering how much that tainted her legacy. And I think the lesson that I take away from Daly, and the idea I come up with often, is the idea of piracy in her work, which is that just because someone has some bad ideas doesn't mean all of their ideas are bad. You don't have to reinvent the wheel if you're trying to avoid some problematic aspect of a theological system. As a person who writes or engages theory, that you can read Thomas Aquinas and take something valuable away from that. And with Mary Daly, there's definitely a transphobia issue in her work, and I think it's deserved that reputation. But I think there's things that we can learn from here and pirate and learn and use as a tool moving forward. So, and we live in such politically divisive times, and it's to the point that there's sort of this bifurcation of modes of thinking on everything, and I think we need a lot more nuanced thinking that isn't really necessarily a middle of the ground approach, but something that takes seriously what the concerns are of all sides, and recognizing that there's probably ideas that are far into my system of thinking that could really help my cause and what's important to me. Right. So since the seminars on radical theology, that was in the back of my mind. Now, if it was for a different kind of seminar, I might pick something different. But in the things I've picked, the beginning of Beyond God the Father, I think is, I don't think anyone could make an argument that it doesn't belong in the canon of 20th century theology or philosophy of religion. And the gender of God is a topic that is really great to talk about and teach, and she sets the parameters of the conversation or moves the goalposts in ways that weren't done before. I wanted to give the sense of having the tools to engage all of her material if you so choose to go further. I would suggest reading most of her work in order, or not skipping to, don't start with the most recent stuff because it's not going to make any sense. But take your time through the work. I mean, you could sort of jump ahead on some of them, but there's definitely a sense of progression of ideas, and she will often change her mind. And that's part of her work too, is saying, I wasn't exactly wrong, or she might say I was wrong, or I was naive, but here's what I learned from that, and here's where I'm going that moves beyond it, and she calls it spiraling journeys. And by the end, she's in a very different place than she was in the beginning, and her use of language, I think, is really fun to read and dissect, to the point that there was a dictionary put out there, or glossary of terms for all of the new words she invented or redefined. And there's a playfulness to that language that I think is maybe Catherine Keller comes close to writing in that way. But I don't know anyone else that really writes in the way that Daly does. And the other thing I'll point out is, if you're serious about contemporary theology, Mary Daly is not someone who is usually seen as an apocalyptic thinker. But and this is something I take from Catherine Keller, Mary Daly definitely is an apocalyptic thinker. And that's, I think, the best way of making sense of her. And of course, apocalyptic thinking and hermeneutics is part of radical theology. So I'm hoping the readings I picked out give the tools to really go deeper with the cool stuff if you want to. When I teach Mary Daly, I use her for my feminism section of my Intro to Philosophy course. And I'm always really pleased when I hear from a student saying, yes, I want to read more of her. Like, I didn't know there were thinkers like this out there, that they really enjoyed or sort of saw playfulness to, but also see the seriousness. And in the book Gynecology, she's talking, which again is the book that became very controversial, but she's trying to develop a method for thinking about violence against women on a world scale. And she's making some really big claims, and they're generalizations, but yet there's still something to be taken seriously, that patriarchy is at the center of creation mythology, and that plays out in different ways, and seeing how it plays out is helpful. And also, from a moral perspective, I'm always challenged by her Thomistic ethics, that things like, there's a lot of talk about supporting of sex workers and that sort of thing politically. For Mary Daly, it's very simple. Like, prostitution is always wrong, no matter who does it or why, right? Pornography is always wrong, no matter who does it or why. And that could come off as awfully simplistic, but I admire the consistency of that, because she's sticking to her guns on it, that, this is about exploitation and power, and we're nowhere in a place in our society where we can really act like there's equality in pornography, right? And of course, that was a big debate in 1980s feminism. So I'm hoping that the participants see this as a doorway into a lot of interesting other issues along with her writing. I hope that you will join me coming Radical Theology Seminar, where we're going to talk about Mary Daly, and you're going to hear a straight white guy talk about a lesbian feminist who was not interested at all in men. And I hope that the participants can really challenge me on my own views too.